Thank you so much, Nona. When Nona called me, what was it, October, November, and invited me to speak, she said, Landry, we need a guy who is well-versed in Cold War history. We need a guy who is excellent at communicating that history. We need a guy who's an outstanding speaker and knows what to do with his audience. Unfortunately, that guy is busy. Can you do it? And I said, sure, Nona, that's no problem. And she said, it's important, Landry, that you not think of yourself as our second choice for this, because actually you were our third. But in all seriousness, let me try to share my screen. And we can begin the show. Though the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II, we quickly became adversaries when the war ended in 1945. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. In the speech, he said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." During World War II, the Soviet Army, known as the Red Army, marched west into several Eastern European nations on its way to Berlin to force a German surrender. As I tell my students, where the Soviet Army marched, communism usually followed. The Red Army occupied East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Poland and several other countries and forced them to accept communist governments that were controlled by Moscow. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain that Churchill spoke of divided the communist East and the free West. The United States believed that the Soviet Union wanted to conquer all of Europe and maybe the rest of the world as it spread communism. So the United States adopted a policy of containing Soviet communism. President Truman announced that the United States would provide economic, political, and even military support to nations under threat. And we started with aid to Greece and Turkey according to this new Truman Doctrine. By 1947, this conflict pitting the United States and the democratic West against the Soviet Union and the communist East was being called the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were never officially at war with each other during the next 4 decades, but the threat of war existed. The United States ended World War II against Japan in August 1945 by dropping 2 atomic bombs there. One atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city Hiroshima. Japan didn't surrender. So 3 days later, another atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city Nagasaki. These 2 bombs ultimately killed more than 200,000 Japanese and destroyed both cities. 2 bombs killed more than 200,000 people. Only the United States had the atomic bomb in 1945, but the atomic monopoly was short-lived. The Soviets got the atomic bomb in August 1949, and Americans were concerned. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dropped from airplanes. Eventually, though, both the United States and the Soviet Union developed long-range ballistic missiles to carry nuclear bombs great distances. In August 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, a missile capable of carrying a nuclear bomb thousands of miles from one continent to another. And Americans were scared. Especially when 2 months later, the Soviets launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik. The perception was that the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in technological capability and weapons production. It was time to catch up. To counter the Soviet Union's Cold War nuclear threat in the 1950s, the United States government began creating an offensive nuclear capability that included intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, capable of reaching the Soviet Union. The first American ICBM was the Atlas missile. Schilling Air Force Base and Forbes Air Force Base played crucial roles in the nation's nuclear arsenal from 1959 to 1965 by building several missile launch sites and housing Atlas E and Atlas F intercontinental ballistic missiles. Topeka learned in October 1958 that Forbes Air Force Base would operate the Atlas E missile and that 9 launch sites would be built in nearby locations. These launch sites were located in the vicinity of Bushong, Delia, Dover, Holton, Osage City, Overbrook, Valley Falls, Waverly, and Wamego. Site construction began on June 9, 1959. The 548th Strategic Missile Squadron at Forbes Air Force Base stood up on July 1, 1960, and all 9 missiles had arrived by October 1961. All 9 Atlas E missiles were housed in horizontal underground coffins with retractable roofs above ground that would expose the missile that would be raised during launch. The Atlas F missile was 82.5 feet long and 10 feet wide. It weighed 18,000 pounds empty and 267,000 pounds fueled. Its nuclear warhead delivered a 4 megaton yield, which means it was equivalent to 4 million tons of TNT. During flight, the missile reached a speed of 16,000 miles per hour. It could travel more than 6,700 miles in 43 minutes. An Atlas missile fired from Kansas could reach the Soviet Union in less than an hour, with a nuclear warhead 200 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Atlas launch sites had to be close enough to hit their targets in the Soviet Union. They had to be inland, out of range of Soviet submarine-launched missiles. They had to be close to support facilities, and as a cost-cutting measure, they had to be built on government property whenever possible. The sites near Schilling Air Force Base satisfied these criteria. The Air Force used the Army Corps of Engineers to build the Atlas F launch complexes. The most sophisticated among the Atlas missiles, the Atlas F was created to be housed in deep, hardened underground silos to protect them against possible Soviet nuclear attack. Constructed of the strongest concrete possible, poured over rebar, each silo was 174 feet deep with a diameter of 52 feet, and each was entirely below ground. Each silo housed a missile along with an extensive steel structure called the crib, which was attached to the silo walls by 4 extremely large springs that allowed for routine missile maintenance. Connected to the silo by a 50-foot long, 8-foot wide tunnel was the Launch Control Center, or LCC. Also built of reinforced concrete and steel, its 2 floors housed the launching equipment and was where a 5-man Air Force crew lived 24 hours a day, ready to launch the missile if necessary. The first floor of the LCC included living quarters with a kitchen and shower for the crews that operated the missile. The LCC's second floor contained the consoles to fire it. To do so, the missile would be raised with an elevator through the silo top, the doors opened, and then it would be launched. The missiles at the Schilling Air Force Base Atlas F sites, along with those at Lincoln Air Force Base in Nebraska, Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma, Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, Walker Air Force Base in New Mexico, and Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York were the nation's first to be maintained entirely underground and stored vertically. Each Air Force base had 12 missile sites attached to it, and they were usually spaced less than 40 miles from each other. The May 13th, 1959 edition of the Salina Journal ran a front page story announcing that 9 sites had been chosen to operate Atlas F missiles close to Salina and Schilling Air Force Base. 3 more were, however, added to the list. Each site was numbered. Site 1 was at Bennington. Site 2, Abilene. Site 3, Chapman. Site 4, Carlton. Site 5, McPherson. Site 6, Mitchell. Site 7, Canopolis. Site 8, Wilson. Site 9, Beverly. Site 10, Tescott. Site 11, Glasgow. Site 12, Minneapolis. Each silo required extensive digging. Once the silo was dug, its wall would be created to house the missile and the multi-story steel structure that would surround it and allow it to be serviced. Then the vertical steel crib, 15 stories tall, was built inside the silo to surround the missile and provide space to store its peripheral equipment necessary for maintenance and operation. Though many people who lived near the missile sites were happy to find jobs constructing them, and states enjoyed millions of dollars that their construction pumped into their economies, some local residents were unhappy with the missile site's arrival. The Friday, May 6, 1960 edition of the Salina Journal carried a front page story about several McPherson College students and others protesting the nearby Atlas F site. Building ICBM launch sites was dangerous. Nationally, more than 50 people died in silo accidents. 2 men died during Atlas E site construction near Topeka, and 5 men died during Atlas F site construction near Salina. A carpenter from Ozark, Missouri died when a wooden form weighing hundreds of pounds used for shaping poured concrete to create silo walls dropped from 40 feet above and fell on his head at the Carlton site. Another man died when the truck loaded with concrete that he was driving from the Minneapolis site to the Wilson site ran off the road into a ditch, rolled, and caught fire. Barely more than 2 months later, a third man fell about 165 feet to the bottom of the Minneapolis silo. The following month, a steel worker at the Glasgow site also died after falling more than 150 feet inside the silo there. The 5th Schilling area site fatality occurred when a heavy pipe fell more than 30 feet and struck a man as he worked inside the Chapman silo. causing him to fall 25 feet to the silo floor. Along with the news that the initial construction of the 12 Atlas F missile launch complexes was complete, Henry B. Jameson, editor and general manager of the Abilene Daily Reflector Chronicle, toured the site northwest of Chapman and gave a firsthand description to his readers. Quote, "The silo portion is divided into 8 levels, and under these is still enough room to place a 3-story building. Each level, all around the center circle, which will hold the missile, is crammed with complicated equipment or prepared to receive it in the next phase of work. Huge diesels generate power for lights, air conditioning, and scores of other uses. Winding steel steps lead from one level to the other, but there is also a large elevator which is busy most of the time." End quote. In mid-October 1962, only 1 month after Kansas's 12 Atlas F missile sites became the property of the United States Air Force, the nation and the world entered into the most dangerous 2 weeks of the Cold War. The Kennedy administration learned that the Soviet Union was building sites in Cuba capable of launching nuclear missiles against the United States, and the Cuban Missile Crisis began. Because of the crisis, all 12 missiles assigned to the 550th Strategic Missile Squadron at Schilling Air Force Base were put on alert. President Kennedy addressed the nation about the Cuban crisis on the evening of October 22nd, 1962. And in his address, he gave a warning to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And this is what he said.
"It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union."
A full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union is what President Kennedy said. A full retaliatory response. Well, that full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union would have included firing the 12 missiles surrounding Schilling Air Force Base and the 9 missiles surrounding Forbes Air Force Base. Fortunately, the Cuban crisis ended peacefully, and none of Kansas's ICBMs were fired toward a communist enemy, nor would they ever be. In November 1964, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara announced that all first-generation American ICBMs, including the Atlas E and Atlas F, would be retired the following year. Between January and March 1965, Strategic Air Command removed all Atlas F missiles and shipped them to Norton Air Force Base at San Bernardino, California, for storage. 18 Titan II ICBMs were attached to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita. The nation's largest ICBM, the Titan II, was 108 feet long and 10 feet wide. Its 9-megaton nuclear warhead was the most powerful warhead of any American missile. Now remember, the Atlas F's warhead was a 4-megaton warhead. The Titan II's was more than twice as powerful at 9 megatons. In fact, each Titan II warhead contained 3 times the explosive power of all bombs used during World War II, including both atomic bombs. The Air Force assumed control of the final McConnell area Titan II silo on January 31st, 1963. All McConnell sites were deactivated by August 8, 1986. The Kansas missile sites provided jobs for more than 3,000 people and an economic boost for Kansas. Most importantly, the Kansas missiles kept all Americans safe during the most dangerous period in the history of the world. My home state of Oklahoma housed 11 Atlas F sites in this same time frame attached to Altus Air Force Base. In June 2017, I got to tour one of these Southwest Oklahoma Atlas F missile launch complexes. These were identical to the Atlas F sites attached to Schilling Air Force Base. The reason I got to tour this site was because I came in contact with the site owner. The man purchased this site in 1999, and now he lives inside of it. This is his home. And in summer of 2017, my father and I got to tour it and take photographs. This picture you see on the screen would have been the entrance and exit for the Air Force crews to enter their LCC, the Launch Control Center. Today, it's a man's front door, and consequently his back door as well. I'm the fellow on the left. The fellow in front of me is the site owner. Now he's standing in front of this entrance. He calls it the wedge. I just call it the entrance and the exit. He has a doormat, a floor mat in front of his door that says no communists allowed. Just kidding. It simply says welcome. You notice the gray door. You open his front door of his home and you start descending steps. Now, if you will recall that artist's rendering of a missile silo and the LCC attached to it by a tunnel, you could see a long stairway going down. This is the end of that long stairway. And by the way, it was a warm June day when I toured this site. And even though it was very hot outside, by the time I reached the bottom of these stairs, it was really quite cool that far underground. At the very bottom, you would go down that first flight of steps, and then you would turn and go down another flight of steps, and then turn and go down another flight of steps, and then another flight of steps. And at the bottom was Maxwell Smart. And he looked at me and he said, 99, we missed it by that much. Not really. The arm you see is of the site owner. In the bottom, near the LCC, I say in the bottom of the stairs, about 30 feet down, you see these blast doors. Now remember, each silo was built to at least theoretically withstand a nuclear bomb blast at the surface. But if something went sideways and the nuclear bomb inside exploded, well, the hope was that these blast doors might spare those working inside. Now on the left, okay, here's the entrance. If you can see on the left side of the screen, I'm dragging my cursor over this entrance that I just showed you. I went down the long stairway, then I turned and went down another set of stairways, and then another set of stairways, and then finally a third set of stairways, and I was right here. Here's the LCC on the left. Here is this long tunnel that connects the LCC to the silo itself. At the bottom of these stairs, you're about 30 or 35 feet underground. On the right, this is the tunnel of the man's home in Southwest Oklahoma that I toured. That would be this piece right here. I got to go inside the tunnel connecting the LCC to the silo. Here you can see the vertical silo, the missile inside of it surrounded by the crib, the 15-story structure, allowing maintenance. There is the site owner and myself looking at a door that faces the LCC. Down to about 30 feet, the silo walls, and I said they were built of extremely heavily reinforced concrete and rebar to theoretically withstand a nuclear bomb blast at the surface. Down to about 30 feet, the silo wall was 9 feet thick. If you follow my cursor from this corner right here in the left to this corner in the right, 9 feet thick, but then you'll notice the wall tapers downward. And at the very bottom of the silo, 174 feet down, the wall is only 2.5 feet thick. This is looking down into the abyss. I took this photograph peering over the edge of the silo itself, looking into this massive structure that once housed an Atlas F intercontinental ballistic missile. Those are my filthy, disgusting, silo-searching Adidas tennis shoes, you see. And I was thinking, please don't fall. Please don't fall. Because it was still another, 30 or 140 feet down to the bottom. During this most dangerous period, all Americans, including Kansans, learned to live with the threat of nuclear war. To increase the likelihood of survival if nuclear war came, national, state, and local civil defense organizations took steps to protect the public. Kansas's communities prepared to survive a nuclear attack. In the early 1950s, mass evacuation of the nation's cities was the preferred method of civil defense protection against a Soviet nuclear attack. Kansas City civil defense officials prepared to evacuate the city, and they used an evacuation map detailing both routes for those leaving the city and emergency personnel to follow in rescuing injured citizens. The Kansas City Civil Defense Department, in conjunction with state and local civil defense committees from both Missouri and Kansas, executed an evacuation drill to simulate a nuclear attack on November 8, 1954. Ahead of the drill, called Operation Scamper, more than 130,000 copies of the Kansas City evacuation map were printed and distributed. Following the drill, Kansas City civil defense officials admitted that they had failed to formulate plans to evacuate hospital patients and prisoners. And the Civil Defense Committee instructed any Kansas Cityans caught unprepared in an actual attack to, quote, lie down against the nearest wall, cover your face with your arms, and leave the rest to Providence. The Encyclopedia of the Great Plains characterized such civil defense efforts as, quote, little more than a psychological salve for the American populace, because President Eisenhower's administration realized by the middle of the 1950s that nuclear war meant national suicide. Nevertheless, the administration continued to promote the myth of personal responsibility for civil defense in order to avoid demoralizing the American public. Salina participated in a 3-day nationwide civil defense drill that began Tuesday, May 3rd, 1960. Some of the city's schools practiced evacuating buildings in conjunction with the drill, but because participating would have interrupted some students' lunches, the high school did not. A story about the drill in the Salina Journal conveyed that this test was the most elaborate test so far of the Conelrad system, which aims to confuse enemy bombers, and explained that Conelrad stands for Control of Electronic Radiation. Local radio stations changed from normal frequencies to designated 640 and 1240 that Tuesday at noon, and carried a recorded statement by President Eisenhower. President Kennedy assumed office in January 1961, appearing to view civil defense more urgently than President Eisenhower. Early in his presidency, the newly established Office of Civil Defense began a nationwide survey to identify existing buildings to be used as fallout shelters and to stock them with supplies. Fallout shelters were intended to protect citizens from radioactive nuclear fallout, which is what remains in the air after a nuclear explosion. If the Soviet Union had attacked the United States with nuclear bombs, even Americans who avoided injury or death due to an explosion would have needed protection from drifting radioactive fallout until it decayed and no longer posed a threat. Shelters were intended to provide that protection. To qualify as a public shelter, a space had to accommodate a minimum of 50 people, include 1 cubic foot of storage space per person, and protect against radiation. The Defense Supply Agency within the Department of Defense provided supplies to local governments, which assumed responsibility for stocking the shelters in their area. The Department of Defense created the Federal Fallout Shelter sign in December 1961, and one was placed on each shelter that met the federal government's criteria. Evacuation was an option for Salina in case of a Soviet attack in late 1961. Assistant Civil Defense Director Paul Bryant explained that the city's evacuation routes could be used to relocate Salina's citizens, including children and hospital patients, if an attack was believed to be imminent. Bryant was confident that Schilling Air Force Base would be targeted. An enemy would try to hit it, he said. The missile sites now under construction make this true of other parts of Kansas too. Topeka and Wichita, for example, must be considered prime targets. In light of Cold War tensions, heightened by the Berlin Crisis war scare of 1961, Nobel Prize winning Professor Willard F. Libby authored a 15-part series of articles for the Salina Journal titled "You Can Survive an Atomic Attack." The 12th installment encouraged parents to allow their children to become familiar with the family's fallout shelter. He even recommended that children be allowed to simulate living in it to prepare for the time when they would have to, or if only public shelters were an option, to let their children know their location. In addition to the necessities of life, shelters should be stocked with favorite children's games and toys to occupy their time and fight boredom during confinement. Libby also recommended that parents provide their children sedatives to calm anxieties and induce sleep to pass the critical hours. The Office of Civil Defense issued food guidelines in June 1964 for federally stocked fallout shelters. Though 1,500 calories consumed per day was determined to be sufficient to sustain daily activity for an individual, the government believed, quote, that healthy persons can subsist for periods up to the maximum anticipated confinement of 2 weeks under sedentary conditions on a survival ration of 700 calories per day. The Armed Forces Food and Container Institute chose 4 items with which to stock shelters: the survival biscuit, the survival cracker, the carbohydrate supplement, and the Bulgur wafer. They were packaged separately and sealed in cans with an estimated shelf life of between 5 and 15 years. These, the pictures that you see on the screen, the carbohydrate supplement can, those are mine. My hometown of Elk City, Oklahoma was cleaning out civil defense storage back in November. These were in this storage building. They had been there since at least the 1990s. They were sent to Elk City, Oklahoma in the 1960s. The city of Elk City gave them to me, and they're now on display at my university, and specifically the Sayre campus where I teach, in a civil defense display that I'm building. Water drums provided by the federal government for local fallout shelters held 17.5 gallons of water. Each drum was intended to provide 5 people with 1 quart of water a day for up to the maximum confinement period of 2 weeks, after which it was hoped that the outside world would be safe enough to re-enter. The federal government also stocked public shelters with sanitation kits and medical kits. In light of the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Salina's civil defense contingent readied for a Soviet nuclear attack. The Sunday, October 28 edition of Salina's newspaper reported that, according to Civil Defense Director Marie Webb, only 10% of the city's population could be accommodated in the city's fallout shelters. Although 24 city buildings had been approved by the federal government as possible public fallout shelters, only 9 were actually ready for use, and none of them had been stocked with food or medicine. By February 1966, however, 84 designated public fallout shelters that could accommodate 34,000 people had passed federal muster. Only about 50 of them had been provisioned with survival supplies, though. The Cold War, however, ended without a nuclear weapon being fired at an enemy. The anticlimactic ending stood in stark contrast to decades of danger, fear, and, at times, panic that gripped many, including Kansans, particularly during the crisis years of the early 1960s, as the Cold War entered its most dangerous period, the apex of which was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the world stood on the precipice and looked into an abyss. Civil defense preparedness became ingrained in Kansas's collective consciousness as the state's communities joined national civilian preparedness efforts to survive a nuclear attack during the Cold War's most dangerous years. The Day After aired on ABC television the evening of Sunday, November 20th, 1983, to an audience exceeding 100 million viewers. The made-for-TV movie depicted the impact of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union by showing the destruction of Kansas City and how the people in Lawrence, Kansas, and Western Missouri coped with the aftermath. These areas of Kansas and Missouri were selected because of their central location, but the number of ICBM launch sites in both states made them likely Soviet targets in an actual nuclear attack, which added credibility to the story. Director Nicholas Meyer told an interviewer years after the movie aired that he didn't make the movie as entertainment. Instead, he considered it a public service announcement. Meyer intended to forego using any known stars, but he relented to ABC because ABC needed some known actors to sell the movie overseas. So Jason Robards played Dr. Oakes, who, shortly after the nuclear attack, makes his way back to the University of Kansas to tend to the living wounded. Also cast were JoBeth Williams, John Lithgow, Stephen Furst, Amy Madigan, and Steve Guttenberg. Broadway actor and future Northern Exposure star John Cullum also landed a role, and Cullum was chosen to appear on ABC just prior to the movie's airing to warn viewers that they would see some unusually disturbing things in the next 2 hours. The post-attack scenes center on Lawrence, Kansas, and Northwest Missouri, where dying survivors cling to life amid the destruction and the resulting chaos that included martial law following the elimination of most civil government. Mental health professionals around the country fielded thousands of hotline calls from viewers who had been upset by the movie. ABC News also aired a special broadcast as soon as the movie ended that included political pundits and scientists who discussed the possibility, causes, and likely consequences of an actual nuclear war. In a poll taken following the day after, 44% of people in and around Kansas City said that they would likely live to see a nuclear war. Much of the movie's cast, including University of Kansas faculty and students, were locals. By the movie's end, most of the characters played by Kansans had died or were barely alive. The movie's final hour depicts the nuclear attack on Kansas City and the aftermath of survivors. And ABC chose not to broadcast any commercials during that hour. The 100 million viewers represented about 2/3 of that night's television audience, and the broadcast still ranks as one of the most viewed televised programs in history. Retired University of Kansas theater professor Jack Wright cast the movie's extras, and his stepdaughter played the role of 12-year-old Jolene. In a 2018 interview, Wright described how Allen Fieldhouse, where the University of Kansas basketball teams play home games, was filled with cots to shoot scenes for the movie's dying fallout exposure victims. According to Wright, in addition to reminding the amateur actors who filled the extra roles not to look at the camera during filming, director Nicholas Meyer also told the Kansans that in the event of a real nuclear war, nobody would leave this room alive. You're on your last legs. The attack on Kansas City includes bright flashes as mushroom clouds ascend after explosions, which is when the government footage of actual missile tests supplement the Hollywood nuclear simulations. And viewers see a rapid fire series of skeletonized people instantly killed in the midst of everyday activities. In a 2017 article about the movie that aired when he was only 5, commentator Sean O'Neill wrote why the movie so affected him after so many years as an adult. Quote, "Maybe it's the sentimentality brought on by new parenthood, but I haven't been able to shake the image of a mother holding her baby as they're transformed into glowing X-ray skeletons evaporated in an instant." The day after had a profound impact on United States President Ronald Reagan, who, after viewing the movie the month before it aired, recorded in his personal diary that watching the movie, quote, "left me greatly depressed. My own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent and see there is never a nuclear war," end quote. In fact, after Reagan signed the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF, with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, the president sent Meyer a message. Don't think your movie didn't have any part of this, because it did. Following a relaxation of Cold War tensions in the post-Cuban Missile Crisis 1960s, through the détente years of the 1970s, the day after aired during a time of renewed Cold War fears in the early 1980s. The same month that The Day After aired, November 1983, NATO began supplying West Germany with American Pershing II missiles. All of Europe was within range of Soviet medium-range missiles, and the Pershing missiles were deployed as a counterbalance. The nuclear war depicted in The Day After is triggered by European conflict escalation, and the movie even includes a Soviet official talking of the coordinated movement of the Pershing II launchers. The 1987 INF Treaty signed by President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev eliminated these missiles by prohibiting all conventional and nuclear missiles with ranges between 310 and 3,420 miles. Just 2 days before the movie aired on ABC, President Reagan wrote of a Situation Room briefing that he received about the American nuclear attack plan. Then in his autobiography 7 years later, he mentioned the movie in writing about the briefing, quote, "Simply put, it was a scenario for a sequence of events that could lead to the end of civilization as we knew it." In several ways, the sequence of events described in the briefing paralleled those in the ABC movie. Yet there were still some people at the Pentagon who claimed a nuclear war was winnable, end quote. 2 days after the movie aired, Secretary of State George Shultz appeared on an ABC TV program. Shultz said that The Day After was a vivid and dramatic portrayal of the fact that nuclear war is simply not acceptable, and that the United States possessed its stockpile of nuclear weapons to deter war. Secretary Shultz also said that the United States intended to pursue a policy of not just reducing its nuclear arsenal, but hopefully eliminating it. The INF Treaty eliminating intermediate range missiles was a move in that direction, and a move toward ending decades-long conflict between the world's two superpowers. Gorbachev recognized the significance of the INF Treaty. He wrote in his memoir that the INF Treaty represented the first well-prepared step on our way out of the Cold War. By his own admission, The Day After encouraged President Ronald Reagan to sign the historic 1987 INF Treaty that, according to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, helped bring about the end of the Cold War. Kansas was central to a movie that played a very important role in moving the world away from nuclear annihilation and toward peace. Kansas's Cold War efforts were among the nation's most important. With 3 of the state's 5 military installations serving as hubs for intercontinental ballistic missiles, 39 of them total, Kansas hosted more Air Force bases that operated ICBMs than any other state. Kansas missiles were part of the nation's awesome nuclear deterrent that moved Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to beg, to plead with President Kennedy during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to pull back from the brink and avoid civilization-ending nuclear war. In Abilene native Dwight D. Eisenhower, Kansas provided one of only 2 Cold War United States presidents to serve 2 full terms. His presidency witnessed repeated nuclear war scares over the Suez Canal, Southeast Asia, the Taiwan Strait, and the divided city of Berlin in communist East Germany. A soldier who succeeded like no other in waging war during World War II. Kansan Dwight Eisenhower succeeded equally well in maintaining the peace as President of the United States. Kansans were also featured in a movie filmed and set in Kansas that motivated President Reagan to sign the 1987 INF Treaty and move the world toward peace as the Cold War's end began. For the duration of the 45-year conflict, Kansas's Cold War efforts were among the nation's most important. And as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about that.
Hello, are you ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, there was a question a little bit earlier asking about a missile silo at Council. Let me turn page here. At Council Grove. Did you read about that or hear about that? Do you know about a missile silo at the Council Grove?
I don't know. Sometimes the designations, in my experience, especially here in Oklahoma, the designations for the various Atlas F or Atlas E missile sites would vary depending on who was providing the information. If it was the United States Air Force designating the sites by number and by location, what I came across in Oklahoma was sometimes one site would be attributed to multiple locations, because these were often, they were not in actual cities, they were in city limits, they were outside of very small communities. And so sometimes a missile site would be attributed to one location by one source, and another source would come along and attribute the missile site to another nearby location. And so it could be that one missile site that I alluded to in the book and in this presentation was one of those sites that the questioner had in mind, and that perhaps it was merely designated as being at a different location.
Okay, and thinking about the tension that the country was feeling in the 50s and 60s, is there any other time in our history where we were in that kind of a tense situation? Like, how would that compare with today on a scale of 1 to 10?
On a scale of 1 to 10, the Cuban Missile Crisis was 112.
Oh, yeah.
No, we have nothing comparable in our nation's history. Now, September 11, 2001 was dramatic and it was significant and people died. Pearl Harbor, dramatic and significant. Thousands of people also died and we fought wars. But the Cold War was an existential threat. Khrushchev and Kennedy sent messages back and forth during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think it's striking how much Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, recognized that a nuclear war was unthinkable, that once unleashed, that the Rubicon would have been crossed, the die would have been cast, and that likely would have meant the end of civilization. And so they couldn't allow that to spiral out of control, because nothing like it had ever happened before. Nothing like it has happened since, for which I'm grateful that my generation, I was born in 1976, and though I was a child at the end of the Cold War, and I barely remember the day after airing in 1983, I remember as a child being frightened at the prospect of nuclear war, but I'm thankful that I never lived through anything as hair-raisingly scary as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had a crucial role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, believed that the last Saturday of the crisis would likely be the last Saturday he would ever see, because he believed he was shortly going to die in a nuclear attack. The Secretary of Defense for the United States believed he was going to die. And I think many Americans did. And fortunately, we avoided that problem. Here in my hometown, during my research, I found out that some of the local civil defense sirens sounded false alarms during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sending frantic parents to the local schools to pick up their children, creating a panic. I can only imagine.
That's really interesting. We have a question from someone who's doing a master's thesis on the missiles in Kansas. And his question is, he's got a lot of information. He's wanting to know, is it your understanding that if the missiles were launched, they would go over in the North Pole?
Yes, that is my understanding. That would be the route I don't complain. I don't claim to understand the scientifics behind it, but they would typically go northward. And then they would ultimately arrive at the Soviet Union via that route.
And if you have a question in the few moments before we're done, feel free to type it in the chat. I will see it and pass it along. But I do want to remind everyone your book is available in the store. If you would like to call the museum at 785-303-5776, you can always ask if the book is still available. It may sell out just quick as can be, but if you give a call, make sure the book's still available. There are a few that will be signed, but it's a really interesting read. I've had a chance to read one or two of the papers he's written, Mr. Lent and Mr. Brewer has written. Another question. Are there any sites? Are there any sites in Kansas open for public visitation?
None that I know of, but that could just be a matter of my own ignorance. I don't know if any are open. It's possible. I know in Texas, at least one Atlas F site is a museum and tours are given. In Oklahoma, we don't have that luxury. I was told that 7 of the Atlas F sites down here have been filled in by the government. They've actually gone in and filled them in with a concrete and sand mix. 5 have not. But even of those, I am only aware of one in Oklahoma that is accessible at all, and I've been inside of it. I don't know if any in Kansas are open and available. I did have the opportunity to write about what happened with many of these sites, the Atlas E and the Atlas F sites. And by the way, even I didn't mention the Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missiles in my presentation. But my 3rd chapter in my book is titled After the Obsolescence, and I deal with what happened to at least some of those missile sites. Many of them were sold to private individuals. Others wound up as the property of school systems. For example, the Holton School District took ownership of the Holton Atlas E site, paid $1 for it, and put a school in it. Kansas State University came to possess 3 of the Atlas sites, 2 Atlas F sites and 1 Atlas E site. In September 1966, the Atlas E site near Wamego was the first one to receive transfer approval to be converted into an aerospace lab by the K-State College of Engineering. However, over time, it was used primarily for storage. It was not kept up, and because of dilapidation, it was actually considered more valuable as real estate. And so it was it was sold by Kansas State in the early 1990s.
Nona, can I ask a question? Nona? Is it okay to ask a question? Okay.
Absolutely.
My father owned a company here, and in the late, I don't know if it was the late 50s or early 60s, he was pulled from work by the government to work in the silos. He was an engineer. Was that typical, do you know, or you know anything about that?
You say
I was very young, so
he was offered a job.
Well, that's not the way I understood it. I understood he didn't have a choice.
That is the first example of that I've ever heard of.
Okay.
I've never heard of anyone being compelled to work at one of the sites.
Yeah. Well, I know he worked in the site north and south of Salina.
My father worked at 2 of the Oklahoma Atlas F sites when they were under construction in the early 60s. He was a pencil pusher, though. He was a desk jockey. He kept time. He didn't do any of the exciting work or any of the dangerous work. But
yeah, I don't think my dad did physical labor. I think it was more the engineering something.
Well, I could see where if you were an engineer, they would want to tap into your expertise. Compulsion, though, I've not heard of any compulsory work being performed.
I just wondered if that was typical or not. So
it's the first I've heard of it, but
okay.
I suppose it's possible.
I had a comment and a question. I was at Wilson Hall in Kansas Wesleyan University when Kennedy gave his speech, and I heard the bombers from Schilling Air Force Base flying over, and we all thought that we were cooked at that point. And I really wasn't as aware. I really appreciate the presentation. It's stunning how many of the missile sites were around here. But the thing I wanted to mention was, and I wondered if you've heard about this, there's a book by James Douglas called JFK and the Unspeakable. And what it points out, among many other things, is that both Khrushchev and Kennedy were under considerable pressure from their chiefs of staff to go ahead and launch. And it was only because of the relatively cool heads prevailing for both Kennedy and Khrushchev that that did not happen. Do you have any insight about that? And did any of that play into some of the alerts or warnings with the missile sites?
Well, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just fascinating. It is interesting that Khrushchev would attempt to bring the missiles into Cuba in the first place. Many speculate as to why, but knowing that a nuclear war was unthinkable. And it is interesting when you look at the amount of pressure. The documentary evidence shows that Kennedy and Khrushchev both were under a tremendous amount of pressure among hardliners in their government, particularly in the military. And I think we know more about the pressure that Kennedy faced. But we know that Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, which I don't think President Kennedy was too happy about. But I don't know if you know about the exchanges between them, and especially the two letters sent late in the going. The first rambling letter from Khrushchev appeared to be, well, it was long, it was quite emotional. And what Kennedy's experts believed was that Khrushchev wrote it without the advice and consent of his military planners. And he's looking for eagerly and earnestly looking for a way out of the problem. In essence says, well, if you promise not to invade Cuba, we will pull out our missiles and missile sites. Then he sends the second letter, which is much more harsh, much more belligerent. And the experts believed, and it proved to be true, that Khrushchev wrote that second letter with the advice and consent under pressure from his military hardliners being much more belligerent and saying, in addition to making the pledge not to invade Cuba, you must also remove your missiles in Turkey.
Right.
And so you're absolutely correct. There was a tremendous amount of pressure on both men. Yeah. And in my opinion, the Cuban crisis was Kennedy's finest hour, or at least 13 days. He was masterful in his handling of it, I do believe, in not backing Khrushchev into a corner, giving him options, allowing him to save face. And his references to the Guns of August, the Barbara Tuchman book about blundering into World War I. And I think, you know, whatever criticisms you have of Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs and anything else, I think you have to say that that was a masterstroke of diplomacy and a way to handle a situation. He was in tremendous pressure by Curtis LeMay and even Maxwell Taylor and the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yep.
And I appreciate everyone kind of hanging with us a tiny bit over the 6:30 mark. There are a couple more questions that I don't think will take too long. We do have a question asking, can you tell us how many missile sites or missile silos there were in Kansas in total?
39.
39? Okay.
39. There were 18 Titan II missiles, 12 Atlas F missiles, and 9 Atlas E missiles.
And then someone asks on the chat, can you tell us where in Texas the Atlas F Museum is?
I should be able to off the top of my head. I cannot. However, if you go to YouTube, there is a wonderful video of a fellow showing us the inside of it. Some of his information is a little bit incorrect. He knows his stuff. The problem was it was unscripted and it was on the fly. It was off the cuff. But it's a wonderful video, very good information, and it should let the viewer know. Just go to YouTube and search, what was it? Atlas F Missile Site Tour, Texas, something like that. And it should take you to the video, and will probably let you know specifically in Texas where this missile site is that is open to the public.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Landry, and thank you so much for answering the questions. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Zoom.